Mark, should I start?
Let's see. We have all the committee members, I think. Yes. Sure. Yeah, I think let's get started. I will, if people aren't muted, I will mute them. Feel free to unmute during the Q&A if you want to ask a question. Beata.
Okay. It's with the greatest joy that I introduce David's lecture today as part of his dissertation defense. There are these exciting moments in the life of a teacher when it is not her or him taking the student on a journey, but it's the other way around. David took me on an intriguing and provocative scholarly journey because originally he came to me from Yale with an interest in ancient scholarly texts, but with the publication of the Yahudo texts, which reflect the life of Judeans in Babylonia, he changed course and told me that he wanted to write a thesis on ethnic minorities in Babylonia, mainly based on the evidence of names, of personal names. So originally I was very skeptic because name giving is a cultural strategy that does not necessarily reflect ethnicity. And ethnicity itself is composed of multifarious identities which stem from a host of different contexts. But David insisted, and on the basis of a data set built from economic records, Egyptians, Carians, and Arabs over the span of several generations, and in a most minute and nuanced way, combining historical philological information from the individual texts with digital data, he was able to reconstruct the micro-history of various families over several generations within the framework of macro-history of Neo-Babylonian and Persian dominion over Babylonia. And his work is really a pioneering model for the way how to use digital humanities and how they should be applied in the study of ancient history, as it goes far beyond crunching the statistical information and combines it with philological and historical research. I ask you to join me in welcoming David, and David, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Beata. Thank you so much, and thank you for seeing me through this long journey. I know it didn't go as expected, but I'm so pleased with the result. And thank you for everyone who's here, who supported me along this path. It's been a wild ride, but I'm very happy to be here. My dissertation is titled Identities in Contact, New Paths for Uncovering Immigrant History and Identity Trajectories in the CE. It presents new findings about the histories and ethnic identities of immigrant groups in first millennium BCE Babylonia. I investigate identity through the lens of ancient real-life social interactions and their concomitant identity signaling and perception, working against current trends that investigate identity primarily from elite perspectives or within a monolithic essentialist stance, where in isolation of one group from others, I offer new insight into identity production and maintenance. I hope that my new approach will be useful in application in the examination of the communities and identities of immigrants across historical eras. During the imperial era of the first millennium BCE Babylonia, numerous groups migrated to Babylonia from all over the ancient world due to military campaigning, forced population transfer, the search for economic opportunity, and as part of imperial administration. Groups of people immigrated to Babylonia from all over the ancient Near East, by force or of their own volition. I study Judean, Arabian, Egyptian, and Carian immigrant communities, families, and individuals. By tracing the social, religious, and cultural aspects of their lives in order to draw conclusions about the developments in their ethnic identities in Babylonia. One example is, of course, deportation of men, women, and children. Although male prisoners of war were often taken upon the conclusion of battles, this image shows the forced march of whole communities and families from the place where they lived their whole lives to a completely new, unknown location hundreds of miles away. In that new place, they had to settle, adapt, and support themselves in new ways. They had to deal with new types of people speaking strange tongues. And as they adapted, they had to figure out who they were in this new place. The basic questions of my dissertation are, what happened to these immigrant groups and to their ethnic identities? Did they cloister themselves and try to maintain and reify their identities of their former homelands? Did they engage with Babylonian society and simultaneously attempt to preserve their ancestral traditions? Or perhaps they were content to blend into their new place, acculturate, and assimilate over time. There are two major impediments that I face to be able to work toward answering these questions. First, the source material available seems to give little information about immigrants, about social life in Babylonia, and about rural Babylonia in general. Second, due to the seeming scarcity information, the research that has been done to date was very narrow in scope. For example, immigrants have been discussed in large degree simply by acknowledging their presence in Babylonia through the collection of attestations to them in cuneiform text of both individuals, groups, and also places. Immigrants were discussed also through their appearance in narrative sources, including Mesopotamian royal inscriptions, the Hebrew Bible, and Greek authors, but without any connection to information about the actual immigrants' lives in Babylonia. Immigrant identity was treated monolithically as one unified identity, unchanging over time. And also, little comparative work was done that might examine different immigrant groups' histories and identities against one another. My solution to these problems of accessing immigrant history and identity in Babylonia is to harness the information available in the humdrum, lackluster cuneiform economic texts from this time, such as receipts, loans, and contracts. Since pre-modern economic relationships are highly socially embedded, the economic interactions evidenced in these texts reveal the social relationships that underpin them. So with these dull texts, I'm able to reconstruct parts of the social lives of immigrants. And via these reconstructions, I gain glimpses of how immigrants presented themselves to others and were perceived by others, or in other words, into aspects of their identities. Until now, Assyriologists, people who study cuneiform texts in the ancient Near East, have addressed immigrants through categories such as slave versus freeman, craftsman versus farmer, fief holder versus sharecropper, and imperial official versus peasant. While such classifications are useful for understanding the social, economic, and political locations available to immigrants, but since they lack an interpersonal relational context, they give little insight into ethnic identities. In my dissertation, I move beyond this limited approach to immigrant identity and attempt to shift the paradigm toward investigating areas of immigrant life where identity comes to the fore. These are contexts in which there is high social boundary negotiation. Such areas include important life events, such as marriages and baby namings, the social activity of women, since they often cross familial boundaries, co-ethnic support and cohesion, situations of identity maintenance in the face of social pressure, instances of the exercise of social agency as seen in economic growth, and the development of social power reflected in the elevation into organizational roles. Through the course of the first millennium BCE, many communities were forced to immigrate to Babylonia. Through the 8th and 7th centuries BCE, we know this mainly from narrative sources. However, in the 6th to 5th centuries BCE, some immigrant groups come into light more directly in some relatively small groups of economic texts. My particular focus in this work is on Judean, Arabian, Egyptian, and Carian immigrants who appear in economic cuneiform texts of the Yahudu, Murashu, and Banashaya corpora, which all stem from central Babylonia in the 6th to 5th centuries BCE. These immigrant groups mainly immigrated in connection with their repeated imperial attempts to capture and hold the Levant and Egypt. This region was only partially integrated into the urban, this region being central Babylonia, into the urban, social, economic, and culturally Babylonian Euphrates axis of the cities clustered around Babylon in the north and Uruk in the south. Instead, the territory focused on Nippur was more connected to the rural countryside, where immigrants were mainly settled. By looking at this area and these groups of texts, I am able to see the fascinating array of interactions between immigrants and Babylon-Aramean natives that are largely invisible in the major temple archives from Babylon and from Uruk. My dissertation project consists of 6 smaller researches, which form its body chapters, aside from its introduction and conclusion chapters. The first chapter includes my work on carefully handling the ascription of ethnic identity from a nuanced approach to the cultural evidence contained in personal names. It also contains a study of the potential participation by immigrants in the Babylonian religious concept of positive and negative religious days. The other 4 chapters each treat an individual immigrant group. In the chapter titled Immigrant Participation in Babylonian Non-Elite Religious Practice, I first developed my approach to extracting the ethnic value of personal names. I argue in favor of using personal names as putative ethnicity markers in historical texts, especially in clear contexts of the differentiation of personal names between different groups, such as context of immigration. Working off of research in the nascent field called the sociology of naming, I show how in immigration situations, and especially in cultures in which names carry intelligible linguistic meaning within the name, that names are given by parents to provide the initial basis of a person's identity, including that of their ethnic belonging. I then tackle the multifarious complex issue of how to deduce the cultural context and ethnic value of personal names in cuneiform texts that has often been overlooked and oversimplified by many scholars. In this slide, you can see 2 of the several possible identity processes that are indicated by name giving. Of course, this is a very simplistic diagram, but this gives a flavor for what can happen. With the help of some fancy digital tricks, I was able to extract over 11,000 personal names from the 1,000 texts I studied and assigned a putative ethnic description to each one of them. The second part of this chapter studies the potential participation by ethnic individuals in native Babylonian religious practice. The Babylonians held a notion of the complete sacredness of daily time, and that each day was influenced by divine powers, making it either a good or bad idea to carry out activities of importance on those days. Utilizing digital humanities tools, I compared the execution of transactions as attested in dated economic cuneiform documents, because almost all economic cuneiform documents have dates on them, with the dates of the preeminent calendar of the spiritual value of days, which is known today as the Babylonian almanac. Hypothesizing that ethnic persons are less likely to align their transactions with the positive spiritual days of the almanac, because I assumed that was a Babylonian cultural religious norm, I developed intriguing statistical findings, particularly in connection with the Judeans. Surprisingly, my findings were the opposite of what I expected. Rather than the Babylonians aligning their transactions with the Babylonian almanac, the Judeans in the Yahudu texts did. I interpret this in connection with the Judeans' adaptations of their concepts of sacred time into the Babylonian religious calendrical framework. The conclusion from this statistical study supply my dissertation with a religious dimension that is otherwise impossible to access. Judean identity in Babylonia during the Judean exilic and post-exilic periods has been a topic of scholarly discussion for centuries. The Babylonian context is thought to have been crucial for the final formation of the Pentateuch and the early beginnings of Judaism. The Pentateuch and later prophets offer vacillating voices regarding the separation of Israel from other nations, as opposed to Israel's contact and connection with other peoples. Through information gleaned through my methodology from the cuneiform texts in the Yahudu corpus, I developed newly grounded perspectives on the development of Judean identity in Babylonia. The initial publication in 2014 by Pearson Wunsch of portions of this corpus of texts from the village of Yahudu and other nearby locations in the central Babylonian countryside met with much fanfare. These texts helped fill the gap in our knowledge of the existence of Judeans in Babylonia between the time of their exile from Judah in the early 6th century BCE and the time of the Murashir texts of the late 5th century BCE, which have already been known for over 100 years. In the years since this first publication, 8 years now, one main stance has developed as the preliminary takeaway from these texts regarding the identity of the Judeans who appear in them. This view is that since the texts show the Judeans to be in regular contact with numerous people of other ethnic backgrounds due to their economic interactions with them, these Judeans partook in a multicultural, highly interactive social landscape. However, I have found evidence that partially contradicts this preliminary status quo, showing that there was a significant portion of the population of Judeans in Yahudu who were ethnically homogeneous. They are the peasant population of Yahudu, who were the vast majority of the people settled there, yet are barely present in these texts. I did this by examining texts related to the tax collection cycle of dates grown on date palms on the lands of the Yahudu peasants, which are called bofis. The main protagonist of these texts is a Judean local businessman in Yahudu named Achikam. 3 texts connected to his tax collection are lists of taxes assessed from a number of contiguous bofi plots farmed by the peasants from Yahudu. This slide shows a traditional modern Iraqi canal and field system, predating modern mechanized agriculture, which approximates the situation in ancient Babylonia. We can imagine the Judean villagers living in their mud brick homes or in reed huts, and walking to their nearby bofi fields to plant barley, tend their day palms, and pick their vegetables. By comparing the collection of taxes assessed in these 3 texts with how much Achikam paid for the rights to collect these taxes, it became clear to me that there were many more peasant farmers than are actually attested and listed in these texts. And when I examined the names of these bofi holders, I found that the vast majority were Judean, meaning, by extension, that the vast majority of the whole peasantry of the village of Yahudu were ethnically Judean. Placing this in its temporal context, over 70 years after the exile, it became clear to me that this group of peasants who were settled in Yahudu in central Babylonia maintained their ethnic Judean identity. Therefore, the scenario of cultural interactions with other immigrants only holds for the local elite of Yahudu, not for the majority of the farmers who were largely isolated in an ethnic enclave. Another important discovery I made was the circumstances into which the Judean community was settled and developed. Previously, this had basically been a black hole. No one knew where or why a community settled after the long march to Babylonia. However, by examining the administrative hierarchy above Ahikam related to the collection of taxes, I discovered that the village of Yahudu was founded on a large estate of a high Neo-Babylonian imperial official, the Beit Rab Mugi. In fact, the Rab Mag appears in Jeremiah as one of the generals in charge of the Neo-Babylonian forces attacking Jerusalem in 587 BCE. In the ensuing years, after the Achaemenid Persians took control of Babylonia in 539 BCE, this estate was referred to the office of the governor of Babylonia and Trans-Euphrasia, first held by a man named Gubaru, and then by a man named Ushtanu. It is this Ushtanu, who appears as the ultimate authority for tax collection on the Bophish lands of the Judeans of Yahudu. Taking this a step further, I researched other estates of high imperial officials. It turns out Babylonian and Achaemenid periods in all parts of those empires, including in Babylonia. I believe I have shown that the forced transplantation of conquered populations to Babylonia and to other areas of the empires often ended with their settlement on unused lands within the estates of high imperial officials. This sheds light on the mechanism through which many of these forced immigrant communities were relocated and on how they were settled and developed in their new places. Ancient Arabians have long been thought of as peripheral to settled agricultural society, acting as pastoralists, traders, guides, mercenaries, and raiders. Arabians have been noted as appearing sometimes in cuneiform texts in the first millennium BCE. In my dissertation, I recreate the existence of two groups of Arabians in the area of Yahudu in central Babylonia, both of whom had close interactions with the Judean community there. One group is from the village of Adabilu, which was very close to Yahudu. This tribe immigrated from northwest Arabia, where they are attested in cuneiform sources and in the Bible. You see in the slide, the red circle is approximately where the Adabilu tribe would have been originally. Arabians from the Adabilu village already had ties with Yahudu Judeans as attested by loans owed to those Arabians already in 551 BCE. The relationship between these two communities continued for over 50 years. In fact, there are 3 cases of the connection of Arabian and Judean names, either of a hybrid Judeo-Arabian name or of a combination of an Arabian name with a Judean patronym or father's name. This evidence for Arabian-Judean intermarriage raises a tantalizing possibility that perhaps these communities of Arabians and Judeans who were settled in central Babylonia were already in contact with one another before their immigration. This could have taken place in the liminal zone of the northern Negev, which functioned as a border region through which Arabian caravans often traveled and supported local villages in which Arabians may have lived. That's shown on the map in that green line. The other group of Arabians, which seems to have no direct ties with Adabilu, is the family of Shinka, based at their small estate, Beit Shinka, the household of Shinka. Idina, son of Shinka, was the tax collector responsible for Yahudu, who initially farmed out the actual tax collection to Ahikam. Later, the tables were turned, as Ahikam took over Idina's position in the local administrative hierarchy. Some members of the family and Arabian coethnics of Idina display South Arabian elements in their names. This is explicable if we view these as early Manain migrants from southwestern Arabia to the North Arabian oases, who were then relocated to Babylonia upon the conquest of those oases by Nabonidus in 551 BCE. Egypt, a longtime rival of Mesopotamian societies, experienced a diminution of its political power, both internally and externally, over the course of the first millennium BCE. Mesopotamian-based empires continued to make inroads on Egyptian regional influence and eventually wrested sovereignty from native Egyptian control. The consequent increase in interconnectivity between Egypt and Mesopotamia leads to some emigration from Egypt to Babylonia. The reception of Egyptians in Babylonia is mixed, with varying developments for elite versus non-elite immigrant identity. Egyptians appear in all levels of Babylonian society, from chattel slaves to temple oblates, to rural farmers, to low-level administrators, and all the way on up to satraps. Unlike other groups, there is little evidence for ethnic enclaves of Egyptians in rural settings, although they are interspersed among rural settlements with other people. A fascinating, unique phenomenon was the visibility of Egyptians who held positions in the local and regional accumulated administrative hierarchy. This was unlike all other non-hegemonic immigrant groups, whose members commonly took on Babylonian names when they entered official posts. Even so, there are indications for the narrowing of Egyptian culture and identity in Babylonia, particularly that the repertoire of available names diminishes. In the long run, Egyptian identity disappears in Babylonia. Carians, originating from the southwest tip of Anatolia, traveled the ancient world in the 7th through 4th centuries BCE as mercenaries in foreign armies, sailors, and stonemasons. Small groups of Carians settled as agriculturalists in Babylonia, sometimes as remuneration for their efforts in the Babylonian and Persian land for service schemes. Some Carians are attested in the northern Babylonian city of Borsippa, intermixed with Egyptians. This has been explained as stemming from the Carian communities in Egypt, including that of the Egyptian capital of Memphis. Another locus of Carian immigration to Babylonia is at a village called Banashaya, which was named after an alternative moniker to the word Carian, but stands for Carian as well. This village was very close to Nippur and appears in a small group of texts in the late 6th century, and then again in the Murashu archive almost 100 years later. Although individuals with Carian names appear in the earlier group of texts, by the time of the Murashu archive, they seem to have at least partially assimilated. Even so, their ethnic presence in Babylonia might persist into the Hellenistic period. Going into my dissertation project, I had only vague ideas of what I would discover about each of the immigrant groups I studied. However, on the micro level, in the lives of individuals and families, I expected to find a wide variety of social adaptations to immigration and of identities of immigrants. This is precisely what I discovered. Some families intermarry and develop hybrid ethnic identities that play out in hybrid naming practices. Some individuals carry two names, allowing them to portray themselves in different fashions based on particular social contexts that they're in. On the other hand, some immigrants hold on to their ethnic identities and cultural practices of their homeland. Sometimes, this is even to their extreme detriment, like in the unfortunate case of a family of Egyptian slaves that are sold within Babylonia from one Egyptian master to another. When viewed at the macro level, or the community and group level, an overall trend in the development of the identity trajectory of each immigrant group emerges. For the Judeans, a multi-tiered picture appears, in which the Judean local elite in central Babylonia participate in a multicultural, highly interethnic social context, while still retaining some of their ethnic identity. On the other hand, The Judean peasantry lives in their village in isolation from acculturative contact, and so maintain their Judean ethnic identity over several generations and beyond. From the angle of religion, Judeans adapted their homeland religious concepts into the Babylonian religious framework, at least in terms of the cycles of sacred time. This adaptation seems to have helped Judean communities maintain a hybridized diasporan identity. In fact, Judean and then Jewish diaspora communities are known in Iraq from the 6th century BCE through to contemporary times. Arabian communities appear in central Babylonia in two waves, once at about the same time as the Judean community, and once after the intrusion of Nabonidus into the northwest Arabian region. These Arabian communities develop and maintain strong ties with the local Judeans and come to vie with them for local power, particularly in relation to the imperial administrative authority structure. Arabians maintain an ethnic presence in the area for well over 100 years, assisted by the staccato pattern of pastoral to settled boundary crossing. Even though Babylonia has a strong Aramean cultural background for many centuries, this pattern of Arabian sedentarization persists all the way until the Arabian influx at the beginning of the Islamic era. Carian communities similarly appear in central Babylonia and in northern Babylonia in the 6th century BCE, but acculturate and completely assimilate within a century or at most two. Egyptians form a fascinating counterpoint to the other immigrant groups I studied. Rather than maintaining ethnic identity in rural locations only, as did the Judeans, Arabians, and Carians, Egyptians are proud to show themselves as Egyptian in all contexts. This stems from the high value placed on Egyptian culture throughout the ancient Near East, particularly in respect for its deep antiquity, as was noted by Herodotus. It also stems from the engagement with Egyptian culture that the accumulated royalty and nobility fostered, as well as some cultural influence of Egyptian material culture that is found within urban contexts. In contrast to this visible presence of Egyptian culture and identity in Babylonia, and in contrast to the other immigrant groups, the Egyptian presence disappears after Alexander the Great conquers Babylonia. This seems to be connected with the lack of settlement of local communities of Egyptians in Babylonia. The final portrait that emerges of identities in central Babylonia, and likely throughout Babylonia, is illuminated by a metaphor of layered tapestries. You see, my graphic design is god-awful, corresponding to the socioeconomic levels of that society. The bottom tapestry contains well-defined shapes of different colors representing the peasantry living in a geography of cloistered ethnic farming villages, interspersed between and outnumbered by similar villages of Babylonians. That is overlain by a tapestry of mixed swirls, changing color as they flow into one another, akin to the interethnic and intercultural social landscape of the rural local elite, who are constantly in contact with one another. On the surface lies a minimalist tapestry, with a deep color covering most of its surface, bleeding to a hazy gray at the fringes. This symbolizes proper Babylonian urban elite society that fades into a mixed Babylonian culture at the edges of the urban social identity. When these tapestries are viewed as a layered whole, the true complexity of life in Babylonia is seen. I'd like to thank my advisor, Professor Beata Poindar-Sleiston, and my other committee members, Professor Dan Potts and Professor Lorenzo D'Alfonso, as well as my outside advisor, Professor Caroline Bertigers, and my outside reader, Professor Michelle Yursa. And thank you all very much for listening to my long presentation, and I'm very interested in hearing your feedback and questions.
Thank you very much, David. We will open the discussion, and in this context, the committee members are asked to refrain from participating in the discussion. Okay, thank you.
Hi, David. I have a question for you.
Sure.
It's not about the specifics of your research or your findings, but more about the arc and trajectory of the work that you did. You mentioned it a couple times that you anticipated to find results of one nature, and in a couple instances you found results that were contrary to what you expected. I wanted to know how that impacted the pursuit of the research. Obviously, finding statistically significant results in any data set can be enlightening. How did it impact the sort of arc or trajectory of your research to anticipate something and then find something different?
Well, thanks, Chaim. Chaim is my brother. Going into the whole project, I really tried to keep an open mind. My goal was to look at the textual sources and a few archaeological sources that I had available, and really let them guide me. Of course, going into any research, you already always have some sense of what you're looking for. So when things like that didn't come out the way I was intending, it sort of throws a wrench into the whole program that you have in mind. But on the other hand, it enlightens you to things that you really wouldn't have seen otherwise and expected. And this happened a couple times for me. Like, it did happen with the Babylonian Almanac Research Project, but then it also happened in terms of finding the Judeans, the Judean peasants. I wasn't looking for them at all. I was just looking through the texts from Yahudu that were related to Judeans, and then I came across these series of texts that were mentioned to be related to one another, but I was able to recognize that these lists of individuals who are mostly Judeans and mostly don't have the characteristic recognition of the father's names, which generally means that they're of lower status, that these were the peasants. If you look at the Judean, the Yahudu corpus overall, there are hundreds of people named in it, but we're looking at a corpus that spans from the earliest text in 572 or 576, and the latest text is in around 490, with clustering in the 520s, 510s, and 500s. So we're looking at a corpus that covers 80 years, and so even if you have hundreds and hundreds of people named in them, this is still a small section of a vibrant village community. So I was really happy to be able to find something about all the other people that live in this community. I hope that sort of answered things.
Ryan King?
Yeah.
I have a question. Oh, sorry. Should I go first? Yeah, you go first, please. Okay. Hi, David. Thank you for this interesting presentation, and congratulations on finishing your dissertation. I wanted to ask sort of a methodological issue about using sort of names as a proxy for ethnic identity by talking about Persian speakers, Persian names. These, of course, start appearing in the Achaemenid period, but as people like Matt Stoker have shown, they disappear very quickly in the Hellenistic period, faster than one would expect from demographic shifts or something like that, which to me suggests that people are no longer using these names, but not necessarily no longer existing or something like that. So when we think about this example, does this sort of challenge how we might think of people using names in this earlier period and how this might affect how people express themselves via their names?
Sorry, Ryan, which names don't appear in the Hellenistic period?
The Iranian names or Persian names, generally.
Persian names, okay. Persians are the one immigrant group that I did not investigate, that being because they actually appear the most in this corpus, and in a sense they're coming into the society as part of the hegemonic ruling power. So it's a little bit different, although I really want to investigate that. I haven't thought at all about the disappearance of Persian names over time, so I don't know how much I can help you with that right now. It's definitely something I do want to look into in the future. Sorry.
Okay. No, that's great.
We muted and everything. Look over here and the participants. Are there other questions or comments? I don't see a hand.
Oh. Claire has her hand raised, I see.
Okay.
Hi, David. Thanks so much for this and congratulations. It's a great project. I was particularly fascinated by your finding about the Judean observance of auspicious days, particularly in contrast to the lack of Babylonian observance of auspicious days. And so I'm wondering, do you think that that's specific to the people in the group that you were looking at, or do you think that a broader look at Babylonian, the dates of Babylonian activities is feasible and might show interesting things about Babylonian kind of religious observance versus religious thought?
Okay, so this is a very good question. Thank you. To begin with, Caroline Vertigers, my outside advisor, already did a study, and this is her. My work was based off of hers to some degree. She looked at texts, I think 1,500 text reports about. I don't know what she found in terms of the overall spread, but she looked particularly at the more important transactions among them and did find some connection with the positive days. I really wanted to focus on all of the transactions because that way I could include immigrants as much as possible and get as big a picture of the potential opposition between immigrants and natives. By the way, natives, I'm sure, are Babylonians and Arameans are natives. And because there simply aren't that many texts of what we would call important transactions that relate to the immigrants. Like, there are only a handful of marriage texts, so that really wouldn't work. So I think my results are good, first of all. I think I found statistical results. I ran them through statistical testing. It is somewhat difficult because a lot of the names of people appear in the same text. So when you have names of people appearing in the same text, you don't have a very well disentangled statistical set. But I tried to counter that by grouping texts by individuals, not just seeing it overall as a spread of every text that includes any immigrant, but grouping them by individuals to see what the individuals, how often they would participate in something rather than something else. Now, honestly, I highly doubt anybody's going to try to do this in a larger data set. It's not, I mean, over time, as our databases of texts grow and become more useful, it could really become a possibility and would be interesting to do. In terms of my findings, I think that finding that Judeans are interested in Babylonian sacred time really jives well with the adaptation of Judeans into other aspects of Babylonian religious time. And I discovered some scholars that worked on this particular issue in terms of the Judean festival cycle. One, for instance, Jan Wagner has this really interesting article where he goes through first of all, he notes that in the different levels of the Pentateuch, the earlier attestations refer to the time of Passover as during Chodesh HaAviv. And he understands Chodesh HaAviv not meaning springtime, but rather as meaning time of the sheaves. that that's what the ancient word Aviv really meant. So he sees it as more connected to the wheat harvest, which is what it was supposedly connected to. On the other hand, it's been long known by biblical scholars that the time of the 14th of Nisan or Nisanu is out of has a disconnect with the actual time of the wheat harvest in Israel. So he puts this together, and in taking layers of the Pentateuch, he sees that the later priestly layers are the ones that are really talking about a firm time frame for when Passover should be, and that the earlier ones seem to be more seasonally based. And so he sees this transition as having occurred in connection with the Babylonian exile, and that as Judeans came to Babylonia, they adopted the Babylonian religious framework, annual cycle framework. 14th of Nisanu is right during the Akitu festival. Similarly, the bipodal idea of having a festival in Nisanu and a festival in Tashritu, he also sees as taken up by the Judean immigrants as having a festival in Nisan and a festival in Tishrei, and that as mirroring also the Akitu cycle. So, taking this concept, I think my findings about the Judeans' interest in the auspicious days of Babylonia fit in this same adaptation to the Babylonian religious temporal framework. So that's where I think I've gone with it, and I think it holds more water because of that, because I've been able to find a connection, a parallel of Judeans doing a similar type of thing. So that's what I've got so far. Thanks.
Okay, David, thank you very much, and thank you to new link. Okay.
Congratulations, David.
So much. Thanks all for being here.
Congrats.
Love you, David. Good luck.
Thank you.